This question is best solved by realizing that you can make use of an important mathematical property, and that mathematical property is that, let me turn on the pen, is that x plus y times x minus y equals x squared minus y squared. Now your first piece of information is c squared minus d squared is 12. And your second piece of information is that c plus d equals 6. Now, checking whether the first piece of information is sufficient to answer your question, the best thing that we can do is to say, okay, let's use this mathematical property where x equals c squared and y equals d squared. Then if we fill in the right hand side, we get c squared to the power 2 minus d squared to the power 2, which equals c to the power 4 minus d to the power 4. And that's actually the expression that we want to know. We want to know the value of c to the power 4 minus d to the power 4. Now, if we fill in the left-hand side of this mathematical property, we get c squared plus d squared times c squared minus d squared. Your first piece of information tells you that this is 12. But you don't know anything about the first piece of information. Therefore, you cannot know the value of c to the power 4 minus d to the power 4. So the first piece of information is not sufficient to answer the question asked. Checking the second piece of information, we only know that c plus d is 6. And that doesn't tell us anything about c squared plus d squared or the separate values of c and d. So also your second piece of information is not sufficient to answer your question. Now let's combine both pieces of information and let's see what we can do then. Again, we can make use of this mathematical property, and now we say, okay, suppose that x is c and y is d. Then we get, if we fill in this, c plus d times c minus d equals c squared minus d squared. Now from the first piece of information, you know that this is 12. From the second piece of information, you know that this is 6. Therefore, you know that c minus d must equal 2. And now we have two linear equations and two unknowns, so we can actually solve it because we have c plus d equals 6 and we have c minus d equals 2. Two linear equations, two unknowns, so we can solve it using both pieces of information. So your answer is going to be C. Now suppose that this was a multiple choice question and we actually had to solve it. Then there's two methods. You can substitute, and that's also the method that we discuss in session 2 of our course. But what we also discuss in session 2 of our course is that a much quicker way to solve two linear equations is to add or deduct them. In this case, if we add the equations, we get on the left hand side we get c plus c, which is 2c, and we get d plus minus d, which cancels out, so this cancels out. And 6 plus 2 is 8. So 2c is 8, in other words, c is 4. And if c is 4, so if c is 4, then d must be 2, because 4 plus 2 is 6. So d is 2. So this is a very quick way to solve two linear equations. You can just add the equations. So that's a very important takeaway point which we discussed in session 2 of our course. In addition, this mathematical property is a very important strategic element which you can use on the GMAT.